No one in the village dared cross the grounds of the Caldwell estate after sunset. Children who wandered too close whispered tales of the widow who lived alone, and grown men averted their eyes when her shadow fell across the dusty road. Margaret Caldwell was no ordinary woman. To outsiders, she was a grieving widow, dignified and composed. But behind the thick, ivy-covered walls of her mansion, she had carved a world of her own, a world where fear and obsession intertwined, and where a young man named Elias Monroe had been imprisoned in silence. Elias's arrival in Virginia had been quiet, unremarkable to the casual observer. He was a stranger, solitary, a man whose past no one dared ask about. Yet for Margaret, his presence ignited a fascination she could not contain. Some said she saw in him a reflection of her late husband, Henry Caldwell, whose death in a sudden accident had left a void she could neither fill nor ignore. Others claimed she was driven by something darker, a compulsion to dominate, to control, to wield life itself like a tool. Whatever the reason, Elias became the focus of her obsession, a living reminder of her grief twisted into cruelty. The mansion itself seemed to watch. Its high windows stared blankly over the overgrown gardens, its cracked walls echoing every footstep. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the faint scent of decay. Margaret's daily routines were a careful performance. She maintained letters, appointments, and social appearances with meticulous care. To any visitor, she was the picture of refinement. But as night fell, she descended into the basement, where every shadow seemed to pulse with the tension of her secret. The basement stairs groaned under her weight, lanterns casting trembling light across rough stone walls. Elias Monroe's room was a corner of darkness, a small locked cell where sunlight never reached. Every day he awoke to the same oppressive quiet, every night to the same candle-lit scrutiny. Margaret observed him with an intensity that made every small gesture feel measured, catalogued and judged. She never struck him physically, but her control was precise, psychological, relentless, and absolute. She fed him sparingly, bread, water, occasional scraps of meat, each portion administered with deliberate calculation. And with every meal, every word, every glance, she reminded him of his dependence. Her eyes measured him, reading fear, curiosity, even fleeting defiance. Margaret's obsession had roots deeper than grief. The Caldwell family had long wielded power and influence, but its history was steeped in betrayal, loss, and secrets that had never been spoken aloud. In the absence of Henry, Margaret had claimed dominion over her world, and Elias had become the instrument of her quiet tyranny. Days passed in a rhythm of tension and silent terror. Elias learned to anticipate Margaret's moods, measuring the subtle shifts in candlelight and shadow that foretold her next move. Sometimes she would pause by the small barred window, studying him with a faint trace of sorrow. Other times her words cut like a knife, reminding him of the world outside that he could no longer reach. In the mansion above, servants moved quietly, never questioning, never noticing the horrors below. Outside, the villagers whispered but dared not venture near. Margaret's obsession grew in layers, intertwined with memory and imagination. One evening, she unearthed an old portrait of Henry from a forgotten drawer. His confident posture, the sharp angle of his jaw, the slight curve of his smile, Elias, in her mind, reflected these same traits. He was no longer merely a captive. He had become a living echo of the husband she had lost. The basement transformed into a theater for her grief, a stage where obsession and memory enacted a cruel dance, each step designed to reinforce her power and test his endurance. For Elias, the days were long and oppressive, measured not in hours but in the flicker of candlelight and the cadence of Margaret's footsteps above. He learned the silent language of her presence, the sharp inhale that preceded a question, the tilt of her head that hinted at scrutiny, the subtle movements that revealed the shift from curiosity to judgment. Each gesture demanded vigilance, compliance, and a fragile hope that perhaps one day she might grant him mercy. Yet mercy was unpredictable. Margaret's attention oscillated between fleeting tenderness and cold, deliberate cruelty. She would sometimes sit for hours watching him, tracing the line of his jaw with her eyes, as though reading some secret only she could decipher. Other times, a single word, sharp and precise, would remind him of his powerlessness. The basement walls absorbed these moments, echoing the tension, the unspoken commands, and the oppressive weight of her obsession. Outside, the Caldwell mansion appeared untouched by scandal. Margaret was elegant, composed, the picture of a widow navigating loss with grace. But the truth was contained in the basement's darkness, where every day Elias endured the slow unraveling of his autonomy. He was a witness to the depths of grief turned into domination, a human measure of obsession and psychological cruelty that no outsider could comprehend. Even the mansion itself seemed complicit, its stone walls, wooden beams, and shadowed corners amplifying the tension. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind through broken shutters, became a signal that Margaret was near, observing, judging, calculating. She moved through the halls like a sovereign of a kingdom built on fear, Elias the sole subject of her dominion. Nights brought no relief. Margaret would descend the stairs with candle in hand, her gaze sweeping over him with precision. She catalogued every reaction, every subtle twitch, every flicker of expression. Psychological games were her craft. Small kindnesses that felt like reprieves, sudden words of cruelty that erased hope, moments where memory and obsession converged to heighten his terror. Elias became a mirror for her grief, a canvas for her control, and the only measure of her power. As dawn crept across the Virginia fields, Margaret would retreat, leaving Elias in the cold, dim basement. He counted the hours, measured the slivers of light, memorized the patterns of her visits, and braced for the unpredictable shifts between mercy and malice. Outside, the world carried on, ignorant of the dark reality that defined his life. Inside, Margaret Caldwell's obsession shaped every moment, every thought, every breath, until the mansion itself seemed to hold its prisoners in suspended dread. The first chill of winter crept through the Caldwell estate, slipping between cracks in the old stone walls and settling in the corners of the mansion's many rooms. To outsiders, the house seemed merely cold, empty, and abandoned in places. But below in the basement, the chill felt like an extension of Margaret Caldwell's control. Quiet, pervasive, inescapable. Elias Monroe, whose body had grown accustomed to the dim light and damp air, found his mind tightening under her relentless gaze. He could not move without her awareness. He could not breathe without her notice. Margaret had made him a fixture of her obsession, a living proof of the power she wielded in silence. Her visits became increasingly precise, measured almost to the second. Margaret would descend the stairs carrying a single candle, her figure tall and unyielding, casting long shadows that stretched across the stone walls. Elias learned to anticipate her presence, to prepare for the weight of her attention. But anticipation offered no relief. Even the smallest gesture could provoke scrutiny, judgment, or subtle punishment. She measured not just his compliance, but the very rhythm of his heart, the trembling of his fingers, the hesitation in his gaze. Every action, no matter how minor, became a silent test of endurance. One evening, Margaret arrived with a small notebook. Its leather cover was worn, and the edges of the pages had yellowed with age. She placed it on the floor beside Elias and opened it to a page filled with sketches and notations. Each line seemed to map a behavior, a reaction, a moment of compliance or defiance. Elias recognized immediately that he was the subject of her meticulous study, not merely as a prisoner, but as an experiment, a reflection of her grief and her desire for control. The realization was suffocating. She had transformed his life into a performance, and every movement, every thought, every flicker of emotion was under her scrutiny. The nights grew longer as winter deepened. Margaret's obsession seemed to intensify with the encroaching darkness. Her steps echoed down the hallways with an almost ritualistic cadence, announcing her arrival in a way that both terrified and unnerved. Elias. Sometimes she would linger at the threshold, watching him silently for what felt like hours, and at other times she would circle the basement as though inspecting every corner, every shadow, as if the very room itself could betray him. He began to measure his own existence by these patterns, learning to predict the ebb and flow of her moods with desperate precision. Food remained a tool of control. Bread and water were routine, but on some evenings she offered a small indulgence, a piece of fruit, a cup of warm broth, or a slice of meat. Each gift, however minor, carried a weight far greater than nourishment. It was a reminder of dependency, a signal that she alone held the power to grant relief. At times the generosity seemed almost affectionate, but the relief it offered was fleeting. As quickly as she bestowed comfort, she could withdraw it, leaving him more anxious and uncertain than before. Margaret's control was not merely physical, it was psychological, a constant negotiation between fear, hope, and obedience. Elias's mind began to shift under this relentless pressure. Memories of the outside world, of freedom, of sunlight and open air, became hazy and distant. He measured his life in small increments, the flick of Margaret's eyes, the rise and fall of her voice, the pattern of her footsteps. Each day was a delicate balance between compliance and survival. Occasionally he would catch a glimpse of her reflection in the glass, of the lanterns or in a polished surface, and for a moment he would see not just the widow, but the woman whose grief had metastasized into obsession. She was both his jailer and a mirror of his own fear. Margaret's obsession deepened as she revisited memories of her husband, Henry. She would often speak aloud to herself while observing Elias, recalling moments from her past life, as though the young man before her could embody Henry's presence. Elias noticed how her tone would shift, softening when she reflected on moments of love or laughter, then hardening as the weight of loss returned. These fluctuations were deliberate, and he understood that they were designed to manipulate him further, to keep him in a state of constant psychological tension. The mansion's walls seemed to close in with each passing day. The damp stone and thick wooden beams amplified every sound, every movement. Elias grew acutely aware of the smallest details. The scratch of Margaret's boots on the wooden floor, the barely perceptible shift of her shadow across the wall, the faint scent of her perfume mingled with the damp air. Every sense became attuned to her presence, each moment a reminder that he existed entirely for her attention and control. Margaret's fascination with Elias was not static. She experimented with his perception, adjusting the light, shifting the timing of her visits, altering the cadence of her speech. Each subtle change tested his reactions, revealing his fears, his instincts, and the faint traces of defiance that lingered despite her control. She was both observer and conductor, orchestrating an intricate dance of dominance and submission, of psychological pressure and rare fleeting kindnesses. One particularly long night, Margaret sat in the corner of the basement, her candle illuminating the lines of her face as she sketched. Her hands moved with precision, capturing not only Elias's features, but the tension in his posture, the uncertainty in his eyes. It was as if she sought to understand him completely, to map his existence in ink and shadow. Elias felt the weight of her gaze pressing upon him, the understanding that he was no longer merely a man but a subject, a canvas upon which her grief, obsession, and cruelty were rendered. Despite the monotony and confinement, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Days and nights blurred together. The passing of seasons was marked only by the subtle chill that seeped into the basement walls and the occasional crack of frost against the window. Margaret's obsession remained constant, a steady, invisible force that dictated every moment of Elias's life. He began to anticipate her whims, to read the subtle cues in her voice and posture. Yet this anticipation offered no comfort. Every day remained a test of endurance, a challenge to survive under her unyielding scrutiny. The psychological weight of his captivity became almost physical. Elias felt the press of the stone walls, the damp chill in his bones, and the unrelenting observation of Margaret as a tangible force. His mind, once filled with the certainty of freedom and self-direction, was now consumed by the minutiae of her control. He counted the seconds between her visits, memorized the patterns of her footsteps, and observed the flicker of her candlelight as if they were lifelines in an otherwise endless night. And yet, within this oppressive environment, there remained a thread of human connection, twisted, distorted but undeniable. Margaret's fleeting acts of attention, her rare words of kindness or moments of reflection on Henry, created a dangerous oscillation between fear and hope. Elias clung to these fragments, however faint, as reminders of both the fragility of his position and the capricious nature of the woman who held his life in her hands. By the time dawn lightened the edges of the Caldwell estate, Elias lay on the cold stone floor, exhausted but alert, attuned to the quiet shift in temperature and shadow that signaled Margaret's temporary retreat. Outside, the world moved on, oblivious to the horrors that had become the rhythm of his existence. Inside, the basement remained a theater of control and obsession, a space where grief, memory, and psychological manipulation coalesced into a force that neither man nor woman could escape. Each day, each night reinforced the unyielding truth. Elias Monroe's life belonged entirely to Margaret Caldwell, and in this relentless dominion, the first threads of obsession, fear, and twisted connection had been woven, setting the stage for the darkness that would continue to deepen in the days and nights ahead. The winter winds grew harsher, rattling the edges of the Caldwell mansion like skeletal fingers testing the strength of the walls. Inside, Margaret Caldwell's obsession with Elias Monroe had deepened, her presence in the basement becoming more calculated, more ritualistic. Each night the shadows stretched further, and Elias began to sense the mansion itself was complicit in her control. The air, damp and cold, pressed against him as though echoing the weight of her relentless gaze. Every step she took, every creak of the stairs, became a signal he learned to read, a cruel rhythm that dictated the boundaries of his existence. Elias had long lost the sense of time. The distinction between day and night blurred into a monotonous pattern of observation and scrutiny. Margaret's methods had evolved. She now tested him not only with scarcity of food or warmth, but with subtle psychological manipulations designed to unravel his mind. One evening she locked him in a smaller, cornered space beneath the basement, a chamber he had never occupied before. The walls were lined with old crates and dust-choked shelves, leaving barely enough room to sit. When she finally appeared, she carried no food or candle, only her eyes, sharp, piercing, assessing. "Do you understand why you are here, Elias?" she asked, her voice calm, almost intimate. Her words were not a question for him to answer, but a statement of dominion. He nodded, knowing that even silence could be twisted into defiance in her interpretation. Margaret circled him, tracing the patterns of his posture, his breathing, the subtle tension in his shoulders. She was mapping him, understanding not only his reactions, but the faintest traces of thought behind them. The basement was no longer a prison. It had become a laboratory for her obsession, a stage for the performance of control. Elias's senses sharpened under the weight of her scrutiny. He noticed the cold drafts that seemed to follow her movements, the faint scent of candle smoke mingled with her perfume, the almost imperceptible sound of her boots against the stone floor. Each detail became a lifeline, a guide to surviving another night under her meticulous observation. Yet no preparation, no strategy, could shield him from the unpredictability of her attention. Margaret's obsession was a living, breathing force, unpredictable and consuming. As days bled into nights, Elias began to perceive patterns in her behavior. Margaret would occasionally speak aloud about her memories of Henry Caldwell, drawing Elias into her recollections. She described moments of laughter, of tenderness, of control shared between husband and wife, yet each story was twisted with subtle cruelty when she directed it toward Elias. He felt himself caught between the memory of a man long dead and the omnipresent force of Margaret's desire to dominate. Each narrative she wove became a trap, a tether binding him more tightly to her psychological grip. Margaret's fascination with him extended beyond observation. She began to engage him in calculated interactions, offering small freedoms that felt like privilege but were carefully orchestrated tests. A cup of warm broth placed near his hand, a slight shift in the candlelight, a word of acknowledgement. Each became a tool for measuring his responses, for understanding the boundaries of fear, hope, and obedience. Elias realized that survival depended not only on compliance but on anticipating the subtle currents of her moods, deciphering the hidden rules of her control. The mansion itself seemed to conspire with her, amplifying the sense of inescapable confinement. The stone walls reflected every sound, magnifying the creak of stairs, the whisper of fabric, the echo of his own breathing. Shadows danced across the floor in ways that felt deliberate, as though the house itself had become an extension of Margaret's obsession. Elias's every movement was observed, catalogued and interpreted, turning the basement into a space of constant tension and silent terror. One night, Margaret introduced a new element to her control. She brought with her a series of objects, small trinkets, old letters and fragments of Henry Caldwell's belongings, placing them around the basement. She observed Elias's reactions with an intensity that left him trembling. Each item became a test of memory, of recognition, of emotional response. A photograph, a ribbon, a half-burned letter, these were not mere relics. They were instruments of psychological manipulation, connecting him to a past he did not know and a grief he could never truly share. Elias began to notice the subtle shifts in Margaret's demeanor. Her moments of tenderness became rarer, her scrutiny sharper. She would occasionally stop mid-step, stare at him for long, unbroken periods, and then resume her ritual as if nothing had happened. These oscillations created a rhythm of fear and anticipation that Elias could never fully understand or control. Each night became a test of endurance, a challenge to maintain composure under the weight of her relentless attention. The mental strain began to manifest physically. Elias felt the chill of the basement deeper with each passing day. His muscles taut, his sleep fractured by the anticipation of her footsteps. He measured his existence in small increments, the flicker of candlelight, the shift of shadows, the subtle cues in Margaret's voice. Every gesture, no matter how slight, carried meaning. Every silence held threat. He was no longer a man in control of his own life, but a subject suspended in a world defined entirely by her obsession. Margaret's obsession grew more intricate. She began to speak to Elias not only of Henry but of herself, her fears, regrets and desires. These revelations were delivered in a tone that seemed intimate yet were laden with expectation. Elias realized that understanding her words, interpreting her moods, and navigating her attention had become his only purpose. The basement had transformed into a crucible of psychological pressure, where every heartbeat and every breath were subject to the demands of a mind, consumed by grief and control. The nights continued to stretch endlessly. Margaret's candlelight traced patterns across the walls, illuminating Elias's fear and his fragile hope in equal measure. She catalogued every response, testing the limits of endurance and resilience. He began to notice that even her absence carried weight. The spaces she vacated seemed charged with expectation, each corner of the basement a reminder of her potential return. The tension became almost physical, pressing down on him, shaping his movements, his thoughts, his very existence. Elias's awareness sharpened under the relentless pressure. He observed the flicker of shadows, the subtle movement of the candlelight, the slight sound of Margaret's voice when she spoke to herself while sketching or arranging objects. Each observation became a strategy for survival, a way to anticipate her next move. Yet the unpredictability of her obsession ensured that no preparation could offer true safety. Margaret's dominance was total, and he existed entirely within the boundaries she set. A prisoner not only of the basement but of her mind. As winter deepened, the Caldwell mansion became a place where the past and present collided. Margaret's memories of Henry were interwoven with the reality of Elias's captivity, creating a complex web of grief, obsession, and control. Every object, every gesture, every word was a tool to test his endurance and reinforce her dominance. The basement was no longer merely a physical space. It had become a theater of psychological manipulation, where every moment was a performance and every reaction observed and analyzed. By dawn, Elias lay in the cold, damp corner of the basement, exhausted but alert. He measured the faint shift of light through the small window, the subtle change in temperature, and the patterns of Margaret's nightly rituals. He had become attuned to the rhythm of her obsession, yet he knew that each day brought new tests, new manipulations, and deeper psychological pressure. Outside, the world remained unaware of the horrors unfolding within the Caldwell estate. Inside Elias Monroe's life was defined entirely by the whims and obsessions of Margaret Caldwell, and the darkness that bound them both continued to grow. The days blurred into nights in the Caldwell mansion, the passage of time marked only by the shifting shadows on the stone walls. Elias Monroe felt the rhythm of the house as if it were alive, responding to Margaret Caldwell's moods, her obsessions, her meticulous control. Each morning he awoke to the same damp chill, the same faint scent of dust and candle smoke, and the knowledge that Margaret's scrutiny would not relent. Her obsession had grown more intricate, threading through every corner of the basement, embedding itself into the air he breathed. Margaret's presence was everywhere, even when she was not physically in the basement. Her influence echoed in the faint creaks of the stairs, the shifting of shadows, the subtle change in temperature. Elias had become a keen observer, attuned to every micro-movement, every whispered syllable, every almost imperceptible change in her routines. Yet this awareness did little to ease the constant pressure. The basement was no longer merely a place of confinement. It was a crucible of psychological dominance, where every thought, every gesture, every heartbeat was subject to her silent authority. She began to introduce more complex elements into his captivity. On some nights, she would leave objects in his space, old trinkets, scraps of paper, or relics from Henry Caldwell's life. Each item carried weight, not for its material value, but for the memory and expectation it invoked. Elias would spend hours analyzing each one, aware that a wrong interpretation or a delayed reaction might provoke Margaret's displeasure. The objects were extensions of her obsession, carefully selected tools designed to reinforce his dependence and magnify his uncertainty. Elias's mind began to fracture under the weight of sustained surveillance. He noticed the subtle patterns in Margaret's behavior, the pause before she spoke, the tilt of her head, the cadence of her steps. Every interaction became a test, every silence a threat. Occasionally she would whisper his name softly, almost affectionately, and he would feel a flicker of hope before it was extinguished by her next cold, precise command. The oscillation between tenderness and cruelty was deliberate, designed to keep him off balance, to deepen his psychological entrapment. Margaret's obsession with control extended beyond the physical and psychological. It became almost ritualistic. She catalogued his reactions, took note of his posture, and observed the slightest flicker of emotion in his eyes. She seemed fascinated, not only by his obedience but by the traces of resistance that surfaced despite it. When he dared a subtle glance away, or hesitated before responding, she noted it meticulously. Elias realized that his very thoughts were under scrutiny, that no defiance, however minor, could escape her attention. The mansion itself seemed to amplify the tension. The stone walls absorbed every sound, magnifying footsteps, whispers, and the faint shuffle of his own movements. Shadows shifted unpredictably, creating a sense that the house itself was aware of her obsession. conspiring to maintain his captivity. Elias learned to navigate the space with extreme caution, each step measured, each breath deliberate. The environment had become as much a tool of control as Margaret herself. One evening, Margaret introduced a new psychological challenge. She brought with her a small wooden box, carefully sealed, and placed it near him. "Open it," she instructed, her voice calm but commanding. Elias hesitated, sensing a trap. The box contained a series of letters, some written by Margaret herself. The others he could only assume belonged to Henry Caldwell. The words were carefully chosen, blending memory, grief, and subtle manipulation. Each sentence seemed designed to test his emotional response, to provoke guilt, fear, or confusion. The letters became a mirror, reflecting not only Margaret's obsession, but his own vulnerability. The winter nights grew longer, the cold more biting, and Elias felt the walls closing in around him. Sleep became fragmented, a series of brief, restless moments punctuated by the anticipation of her arrival. He began to dream in fragments of her presence, her footsteps on the stairs, the flicker of candlelight, the intense weight of her gaze. Even in unconsciousness, he could not escape her influence. Margaret had extended her control into the very fabric of his perception, blurring the lines between reality and fear. Despite the oppressive conditions, Elias found small threads of awareness, subtle moments where he could sense his own agency, a pause before answering her question, a controlled breath, a calculated glance. These were tiny acts of defiance, almost imperceptible but significant. Margaret, ever observant, noted these shifts. Her fascination deepened, and with it, her control became more intricate. She seemed to study not just his reactions, but the emergence of will within him, a flicker of self that had survived the relentless pressure of captivity. Margaret's obsession often turned inward during these nights. She would speak to herself softly, recounting memories of Henry Caldwell with meticulous attention to detail. Each recollection was infused with both love and grief, yet always filtered through the lens of her dominion over Elias. He listened, absorbing the cadence of her voice, the subtle inflections, the shifts between tenderness and obsession. Every word reinforced the structure of her control, binding him further into her psychological web. The basement had become a theater of anticipation. Elias learned to anticipate her moods, the timing of her steps, the cadence of her voice, the way candlelight reflected across the stone walls. Every pattern was a signal, a guide, a warning. Yet despite this attunement, the unpredictability of Margaret's obsession ensured that no measure of preparation could guarantee safety or relief. Her dominance was total, and he existed entirely within the boundaries she defined. One particularly long night, she lingered near him for hours, speaking softly of Henry, of loss, of power, of control. Her words flowed like a current, pulling him into a state of both fear and twisted fascination. She spoke of freedom, as if it were a fragile privilege, one that could be granted or withdrawn at her discretion. Elias felt the weight of her control pressing upon him in every gesture, every pause, every shift of tone. It was an unrelenting psychological force, shaping every thought, every breath, every fleeting hope. By the first light of dawn, Margaret would retreat to the upper floors, leaving Elias alone with the shadows, the cold, and the lingering presence of her obsession. He lay on the stone floor, mentally retracing the events of the night, measuring the subtle cues that had dictated his every reaction. The mansion remained silent, the world outside oblivious while inside. The basement had become a crucible of psychological domination, preparing him for the next escalation of Margaret's relentless control. Elias understood one immutable truth: survival required complete attunement to Margaret Caldwell's obsessions, a careful balance of compliance, observation, and the smallest acts of resistance. The basement was no longer merely a prison. It was a landscape of fear, memory, and control, where every day, every night, every flicker of candlelight reinforced the depth of her domination and the fragility of his own will. The Caldwell mansion had grown colder with each passing week, its stone walls biting through the thin layers of clothing that Elias Monroe clung to. Margaret Caldwell's obsession had evolved into something more deliberate, more calculated, her presence a constant, invisible weight, even when she was absent from the basement. Every corner, every shadow, every flicker of candlelight seemed aligned with her will. The house itself was a conduit for her control, amplifying the psychological pressure she imposed on him. Elias had begun to measure his life not by hours or days, but by the nuances of her attention. A pause before she spoke, the tilt of her head, the soft hiss of her boots against the stone floor. Each subtle gesture dictated the rhythm of his survival. Even the smallest deviation in her routine could signal danger or unexpected reprieve. Margaret's dominance was now ritualistic, precise, and total. Each interaction was an experiment, each observation a measure of his endurance, each flicker of her gaze a challenge he could not ignore. She introduced new methods of control, layering complexity upon the psychological landscape of the basement. One night, she brought in a collection of Henry Caldwell's personal items, an embroidered handkerchief, a silver pocket watch, a leather-bound journal. She placed them deliberately around Elias's confined space, observing as he noticed, as he reacted. Each item became a test of memory, of comprehension, of emotional reaction. Elias felt the weight of her gaze press against him. A silent command to respond correctly or face subtle consequences. The items were not simply reminders of the past. They were instruments of manipulation, binding him to her obsession in a web that grew more intricate by the hour. Winter deepened, and with it the isolation intensified. Elias found himself haunted by the rhythm of her visits, the cadence of her words, the subtle shifts in tone that could indicate both mercy and danger. He had become attuned to her patterns, reading them as one might read the flight of birds before a storm. Yet no preparation could shield him from her unpredictable cruelty. Margaret's obsession had reached a point where her interest in his reactions and resilience rivaled her grief. She was no longer merely mourning Henry. She was sculpting Elias into a living reflection of her desires and fears. Occasionally she would speak of freedom, her voice soft and almost intimate, only to withdraw it with a sharp command or a pointed glance. The oscillation between kindness and cruelty became a mechanism for control. Elias learned quickly that hope itself could be a weapon in her hands, a fragile thread that, if grasped too eagerly, could snap and leave him suspended in despair. Her psychological games were relentless, calculated with precision, leaving no room for error. Elias's own mind began to rebel subtly. In moments when Margaret's gaze faltered or her attention was diverted, he experimented with small acts of resistance, a deliberate pause, a measured glance away, a slow, controlled breath. Each tiny act carried enormous risk. Yet he discovered that his survival depended not only on compliance but on understanding his own limits, reading the spaces between her gestures and anticipating the unspoken rules of her dominion. Margaret, ever perceptive, seemed to notice these shifts, her fascination with his subtle defiance intensifying. The basement itself became a character in their twisted narrative. Its stone walls reflected every sound, amplifying the softest whisper, the faintest shuffle of movement. Shadows stretched and contracted in ways that seemed deliberate, as though the house conspired with Margaret to heighten his unease. Every detail, the chill of the air, the smell of damp wood, the flicker of candlelight, was a measure of her control. Elias's every action was observed, analyzed, and interpreted, turning the space into a landscape of psychological torment that seemed to expand with each passing day. One evening, Margaret lingered longer than usual, speaking of Henry Caldwell in a voice threaded with grief and obsession. She recounted memories of their life together, weaving them with meticulous detail into the present moment, as if Elias were a participant in a narrative he could never fully grasp. Each story was a lesson, a test, and a reflection of her power. She would pause, studying his reactions, noting the slightest twitch of his brow, the faintest tension in his jaw, cataloguing his responses with precision. It was a game of dominance disguised as mourning, and Elias could feel himself unraveling under its weight. Food and warmth remained tools of psychological manipulation. Bread and water were routine, but occasional indulgences, a slice of meat, a cup of broth, a piece of fruit, were carefully measured and administered with intent. These acts of nominal kindness carried a disproportionate weight, reinforcing the precariousness of his position. Elias came to understand that even relief was a weapon in Margaret's hands, a subtle means of reminding him of the absolute control she wielded over his existence. Despite the relentless pressure, Elias's mind began to sharpen in response. He studied her behaviors, memorized her patterns, and sought to exploit the fleeting moments when her attention lapsed. These small observations offered him a fragile sense of agency, a thread of hope in an environment designed to suffocate it. Yet he knew that any misstep could be catastrophic. Margaret's obsession had trained her to detect even the slightest sign of defiance. Survival depended on perfect calibration of obedience and subtle rebellion, an impossible balance in a world dominated by her scrutiny. Margaret's obsession also had a performative element. She would sketch his features, record his behaviors, and occasionally speak of him to herself in tones that oscillated between tenderness and chilling detachment. Elias sensed that every nuance of his existence was being catalogued, understood and integrated into her narrative. He had become more than a prisoner. He was a living extension of her grief, a vessel for her need to control and dominate. Each day reinforced the inescapable truth: he existed entirely within the boundaries she defined. Night after night, the basement became a theater of anticipation. Elias measured the subtle shifts in light, sound, and movement, attuned to Margaret's presence even in her absence. Her attention, even when indirect, shaped the rhythm of his thoughts, the cadence of his breathing, the alignment of his movements. He had become a man defined by observation, caught between fear, hope, and the faint, dangerous stirrings of resistance. The mansion itself seemed to pulse with the tension of their interaction, the walls absorbing every detail, every flicker of emotion, amplifying the psychological weight pressing down upon him. By the first light of dawn, Margaret would retreat to the upper floors, leaving Elias to contemplate the night's trials. The basement was cold, dark and oppressive, yet in that solitude he found a glimmer of strategy, a fragile sense of self that had survived the relentless scrutiny. Each day and night reinforced the paradox of his existence: dominated, yet acutely aware; confined, yet slowly learning the nuances of her obsession. Elias understood one immutable truth with increasing clarity: survival required not only compliance but observation, patience, and the careful management of every flicker of thought and emotion. The Caldwell mansion, with its stone walls, shadows, and unyielding chill, had become both prison and arena, a landscape where Margaret Caldwell's obsession defined every aspect of his life. And within this relentless dominion, the seeds of resistance, small, subtle, dangerous, had begun to take root, waiting for the right moment to grow. The Caldwell mansion seemed alive with winter's final grasp, its stone walls exhaling cold and shadow into every crevice of the basement. Elias Monroe, worn thin by months of relentless psychological pressure, had grown hyper-aware of every flicker of light, every echo of footsteps, every subtle shift in Margaret Caldwell's attention. Her obsession had reached a level that was almost unbearable, a constant, omnipresent force that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. Every night she descended with her candle, every gesture precise, calculated and deliberate, her eyes tracing his movements as though cataloguing not just his actions but the very essence of his being. Margaret's fixation had become ritualistic and surgical. she introduced new psychological manipulations, fragments of Henry Caldwell's personal effects, letters with hidden emotional cues and small, deliberate inconsistencies in her routine that forced Elias to constantly second-guess himself. Each object, each phrase, each pause was calibrated to test his endurance, to explore the boundaries of his fear, obedience, and fleeting hope. Elias had learned to anticipate her presence, yet no matter how attuned he became, the unpredictability of her behavior ensured that he remained suspended in a perpetual state of tension. The basement was no longer simply a space of confinement. It had become a theater where Margaret conducted her obsession with precision. She would sometimes whisper his name softly, her voice threading through the shadows like a dangerous lullaby, and other times she would remain completely silent, letting the oppressive darkness itself communicate her control. Elias learned to navigate these extremes, his mind stretched taut between vigilance and the desperate need for survival. Every heartbeat was a negotiation, every breath a measurement of compliance, and every subtle defiance a calculated risk. One night, Margaret introduced what she referred to as a test of memory and will. She placed a series of letters and small mementos from Henry Caldwell's life in a deliberate arrangement around Elias. Each item carried a weight of expectation. Each was an emotional lever designed to evoke response, submission, or defiance. She watched him silently, her eyes fixed, unblinking, calculating. Elias knew that even the smallest misstep could provoke her attention in a way that might tip the precarious balance of his endurance. He moved slowly, deliberately, analyzing each item, controlling his reactions, measuring the subtle inflections in her tone and the faint shifts in her gaze. The psychological strain had begun to manifest physically. His limbs ached from prolonged confinement, his sleep fragmented by the tension of anticipation, and his senses sharpened to a painful degree. Every whisper of wind, every shadow, every faint creak of the mansion above was a signal. Elias could sense Margaret's presence even when she was not there, the weight of her obsession extending beyond the physical boundaries of the basement. It pressed on him, shaping his thoughts, his fears, and the fragile threads of resistance he had cultivated over months of captivity. Margaret's obsession reached a fevered pitch when she began to speak aloud of her memories of Henry Caldwell in increasingly intricate detail. Each narrative was infused with longing, grief, and the subtle threads of cruelty that had defined her control over Elias. She described intimate moments, trivial habits, and private jokes, blending them seamlessly with commands, tests, and expectations directed at him. Elias had become a living mirror of her grief, an unwitting participant in a drama where memory, obsession, and power intertwined. Every gesture, every glance, every pause was loaded with meaning, and he felt the weight of it pressing upon his very psyche. Despite the oppressive domination, Elias's subtle resistance had begun to grow in sophistication. He learned to exploit moments of distraction, to manage the smallest expressions of self, to read the faintest signals in her behavior. Each minor act of defiance, a carefully measured pause, a glance away, a controlled breath, was a calculated risk that allowed him to retain a fragment of his autonomy. Margaret, ever perceptive, seemed fascinated by these sparks of resilience, her obsession intensifying as she observed the interplay between fear, compliance, and subtle defiance. The mansion itself seemed to conspire with Margaret, amplifying the tension. The stone walls reflected every sound. The flickering candlelight cast long, unpredictable shadows, and the cold, damp air seemed to press in with deliberate intent. Elias's every movement was scrutinized, analyzed, and catalogued. The basement had become a crucible, forging his endurance and his awareness, while simultaneously testing the limits of his psychological resilience. He was acutely aware that survival depended not just on obedience, but on understanding the full measure of her obsession and anticipating its unpredictable oscillations. Margaret's fascination extended to the minutiae of his existence, She catalogued his posture, the tension in his shoulders, the slightest twitch of an eyelid, and the flicker of expression across his face. Each reaction became a data point in her obsessive mapping of his mind. The interplay between her grief for Henry and her desire for control over Elias created a landscape of psychological complexity where fear, attachment, and obsession were intertwined. Elias found himself caught between terror and curiosity, dread and a grim sense of fascination, understanding that each moment reinforced the totality of her dominion. The nights became increasingly elaborate. Margaret would linger for hours, whispering, observing, testing, and manipulating. She seemed to thrive on the oscillation between hope and despair, a dynamic that Elias had come to understand as central to her control. Small acts of kindness, a whispered question, a shift in candlelight, all became instruments of dominance. The basement's oppressive darkness was alive with her presence, shaping the contours of his mind, drawing him deeper into her psychological landscape. One particularly harrowing night, Margaret introduced a final test. She placed a single candle on the floor, surrounding it with a series of Henry Caldwell's possessions: the journal, a silver locket, letters, and a delicate handkerchief. "Choose," she commanded softly, her voice threading through the shadows, "which you will carry with you into tomorrow." Elias understood instantly that this was more than a test of memory. It was a test of allegiance, of submission, of his ability to navigate the labyrinth of her obsession without breaking entirely. Each item represented not just Henry, but Margaret's power. Her grief fanned the precarious balance of his survival. He reached for the journal, feeling the weight of her gaze, the chill of the stone beneath his hands, the oppressive silence of the basement pressing in. Every movement was deliberate, calculated, a silent negotiation with both fear and his own will. Margaret observed, her expression unreadable, the candlelight casting shifting shadows across her sharp features. Elias felt a surge of determination, a fragile assertion of agency in the midst of relentless domination. Margaret's reaction was subtle but profound, a faint nod, a soft exhale, a brief tracing of her gaze across his features. These small gestures carried enormous weight. She did not speak, did not move, yet her presence was overwhelming. The basement seemed to pulse with tension, the shadows stretching and contracting in response to the delicate balance of fear, compliance, and defiance. Elias realized that, despite the months of psychological torment, he had managed to assert a tiny thread of self in the midst of her domination. By dawn, Margaret retreated to the upper floors, leaving Elias with the candle, the journal, and the lingering weight of her obsession. The basement was silent, yet charged with the intensity of her presence. Elias sat in the dim light, reflecting on the months of captivity, the relentless manipulation, the oscillation between mercy and cruelty. He understood the full extent of her obsession, and for the first time felt a measure of clarity in the chaos. Survival was no longer simply endurance, it was observation, calculation, and the careful management of each subtle act of defiance. The Caldwell mansion remained shrouded in winter's grip, its walls echoing with the past, the present, and the unyielding obsession that defined Margaret Caldwell. Elias Munro had endured months of psychological torture, manipulation and confinement, yet within him remained the flicker of resilience, a thread of autonomy that could not be extinguished. Margaret's obsession had reached its peak, yet it had inadvertently illuminated the contours of his own mind, the strategies of survival that might one day guide him beyond the basement's oppressive walls. In the stillness of the early morning, the flicker of the candle cast long shadows across the stone floor, illuminating the journal in Elias's hands. The room, the mansion, and the legacy of obsession it held were all intertwined, and in that tenuous space between darkness and light, captivity and awareness, Elias Munro prepared for whatever Margaret Caldwell's obsession would demand, next aware that survival depended not just on submission, but on the careful, deliberate assertion of the smallest fragments of self in a world dominated by relentless control.